Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 9, Section 1, Opposing Sides. So let's begin. The Civil War began really in earnest in 1861, but it was the election of 1860 that really got the ball rolling. And as you can see, there were a variety of dates here where our southern states seceded. South Carolina, roughly 6 weeks after the November election of 1860, and then in a period of time um, spanning a little less than a month, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all secede, and then eventually Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Okay, and eventually we get a map that kind of looks like this with our blue and our gray. But we also need to recall that there were some border states, states like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. They were all technically with the Union, but they were border states where there were sympathizers with the South. And eventually you're going to see some areas here, particularly Missouri and Kentucky, where there are going to be some battles that are going to take place. Even Maryland. Can't forget about the Battle of Antietam that takes place there as well. So, number one, who received an offer from General Winfield Scott, who was, by the way, the chief of staff for the U.S. Army, to command Union troops? And that would happen to be Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was a man from Virginia, and he had been asked to basically be the kind of the head of the Union Army, particularly the Army of the Potomac. But Lee turned him down. And he turned him down for a really simple reason. Um, Literally, within 24 hours of being offered this, Virginia had seceded. And Robert E. Lee was from Virginia. He was from Arlington, which is right across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. And he really didn't see himself being able to raise um, arms against his own state. And so he opted not to take this assignment and eventually is offered an assignment within the Confederate military and eventually takes that on. Number two, where were seven of the eight American military colleges in 1860? Well, all but one of them were located in the South. The only one that's located in the North was actually West Point. And West Point Military Academy, or the Army Academy, is actually located in New York. Where were most of the Navy's warships located when the Civil War began? And the majority of them were actually located in the North. We had, several ports that were well established in the North, like Boston and Providence, Hartford, maybe even New York, Philadelphia. So this gave the Union, certainly, at least their Navy, a major advantage. Plus, a lot of the warships um, were already in the hands of the Union. The Confederates really never really had a Navy that was anywhere compared to what the Union had. So they had a huge advantage in that department. Number four, how did the North's population affect its ability to raise an army? Well, the North in 1860 certainly had a lot of people, about 22 million, and that's a huge military advantage. And if we look at the map here, um, anything that's kind of got a darker color, darker purples and stuff, that shows you very high population density. And a lot of our northern states, particularly in the Northeast, had high levels of density. And certainly that shows you that they have a pretty good advantage in that department. Other advantages that you might see, maybe in terms of the North, our Northerners were a little more urban. They had large cities like New York, which had 1 million people, a lot of manufacturing, and that's really key. We have iron, we have textiles, we have shoes, we have farm machinery and meat packing, and you name it. Um, we also have a lot of immigrants that are coming through the North at this point in time. A lot of Irish because of the potato famine have already established themselves. We have Germans and Scandinavians coming, the farm, and we have British that are coming every so often. Railroads, the North certainly has an advantage there. So, in a way, the Northerners are starting off this war kind of on a stronger footing than maybe our Confederates. So, why was it difficult for the South to distribute food during this war? It has, again, a lot to do with those railroad lines. Looking at the map on the left hand side, you might notice that there are far more railroad lines in the North, especially along the Great Lakes, compared to the South. There was really only one major railroad line in the Deep South that actually connected the South to the western part of its territory. And that would be a problem. In the North, we could move food, we could move men. It was a huge advantage for the Union to have this. Number six, how did Congress get money to pay for the war? Well, they passed an act, the Legal Tender Act. This act, for the most part, created a national currency, which was really the first time we had a really national currency, and it allowed the government to issue some paper money. Before this act, local banks would actually issue their own currency. So if a bank had quite a few deposits, they could actually issue more currency that way. That meant that literally every paper bill prior to this act looked different. So if one bank issued a currency, they might have a local individual printed on it or have their own little watermarks on it. So there was no uniformity to it. By having this legal currency, or at least a national currency, it made it harder to counterfeit. And one of the things I want to point out is the early bills that we had in the United States actually were only printed on one side and they were not printed in green ink. It's only after this Legal Tender Act that we see the use of green ink and actually printing on both sides of the bill. And part of that was to make it harder to be counterfeited. Though I'll say this, there are still going to be bills that are going to be counterfeited, and that's going to become a huge issue for our government. What was the rate of inflation in the South by the end of the war? The rate of inflation was roughly 9,000%. It's very similar to what you might find in Germany following the end of World War One. But if you can take a look at the graph that we have below here, this kind of shows you the Confederate inflation rates. And at some point in time, it really does jump up. Um, we have moderate inflation. We get to kind of the last year of the war, so we're about 1864. It is huge, and eventually kind of plummets at some point. All right, who were the war Democrats? War Democrats were Northerners who supported the war to restore the Union, but they also opposed ending slavery. Some examples of war Democrats would include Stephen Douglas and a man named Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson would eventually become the Vice President of the United States in the second term of Abraham Lincoln's presidency. Johnson is a unique figure because he was from the state of Tennessee. And if you recall, just a little bit ago, we looked at a map, and Tennessee did secede from the Union. Johnson chose not to recognize that and stayed loyal to the Union. And part of adding him to Lincoln's presidential ticket in his second term was because of that loyalty. He was rewarded with that position. But eventually he ends up becoming president, and a lot of people say that he probably wasn't the best president in American history. And we'll get to that later. Anyway, number nine, why did Republicans refer to peace Democrats as copperheads? Well, copperheads basically were considered to be traitors. Right in the middle here, we have a man that was a previous president, James Buchanan. He was viewed as a copperhead, and hence he was kind of seen as a bad guy. Number 10. When did Congress introduce the militia law? This law was introduced in 1862 with the whole idea of perhaps maybe trying to get more men into the military. Number 11. Why did President Lincoln suspend the writs of habeas corpus? If you remember back to world history, we talked a little bit about the writs of habeas corpus because it has a principle of English law. But habeas corpus basically means that you have to produce a body of evidence when you accuse somebody of a crime. So in this case, this was to enforce the militia law by imprisoning those who supported the rebels, meaning that they supported the South, or encouraged others to resist the militia draft. In other words, don't get drafted, you should rebel against the draft. Those individuals who spoke out against it might have been arrested and held in prison without ever coming before a judge to stand trial. And by suspending this writ, you could hold somebody indefinitely until the writ would be reinstated. Number 12. Why did the British refuse to recognize the Confederacy? Well, the British really didn't want to have to go to war again. They had been uh, in a number of wars in Europe in the early half of the 19th century. They fought some over here in the Western Hemisphere as well. So the British really didn't want to have to deal with that. They were more interested in building their empire so the sun would never set on them. But there would be two men who would try to appease the British. So let's talk about number 13. Who were James Mason and John Slidell? And these two guys were representatives from the Confederacy. What they wanted to do is to see if they could meet with the British and maybe even French officials to see if maybe those foreign nations would side with the Confederacy and recognize them as a legitimate nation. And what's interesting is that these men would be apprehended and arrested in an event that is known as the Trent Affair. Uh, the British, for the most part, and the French, never get involved in the American Civil War. The British came close, but they never officially got involved. Both sides did send observers, meaning that the French and the British sent observers to watch our war, but they never participated in it, meaning that they never took up arms against Americans. And so the American Civil War is truly an American Civil War. There were no other foreign powers that were involved in this, and that makes it very unique. Number 14. What resulted from the combination of rifles and trenches? Well, neither one of them is a good combination, but defenders were able to inflict a high casualty um, on attacking forces because you had guns that were far more accurate, and the trenches provided a certain amount of protection. Number 15. How did Southerners react to Jefferson's Davis's plan to fight a defensive war of attrition? Well, we'll try moving this. Well, there we go. Many were upset because they thought they were better fighters who normally took offensives. Um, Number 16, what was the Anaconda Plan? This was General Winfield Scott's belief that he wanted to fight a long war that slowly would deprive the South of its resources. Winfield Scott would cut the South in half and strangle it. Thank you very much.